Hello and welcome to the first ever Digital Charlotte online meetup. I'm your host, Bruce Clark, and we're excited to have you join us for the next 45 minutes as we explore the intersection of digital equity and workforce development. We'd also like to welcome our viewing audience joining us on Facebook Live and remind you that we will be taking questions in the comments. Our producers are monitoring the feed and we'll get to your questions as the discussion begins. As the need for digital equity expands, cities across the United States face the task of preparing all residents for an increasingly tech-powered world. Most jobs now, at the very least, require basic computer literacy skills to operate email and other software. At home, residents need access to the internet and consumer technologies to do homework, shop online, communicate with one another, or build a resume and apply for a job. But we know in our community, nearly 20% of Mecklenburg County residents lack adequate internet access in the home, and many more lack access to high-quality, low-cost technology and digital literacy training. However, digital equity holds out the promise of a more widely shared access to opportunity, but achieving that vision will require every person having basic digital literacy skills. The ability to use hardware and software to manage information, communicate, navigate the web, solve problems, and create content. Joining us today, we're grateful to have three distinguished guests. From my right, Dr. Patrick Graham. Patrick is the president and CEO of Charlotte-Works. Charlotte-Works is a workforce leader that convenes and leads an integrated workforce system through partnerships, policies, and career pathways in a market-driven economy. Patrick is also the author of several academic and popular media essays on subjects ranging from migration, civil rights, Black Power movement, and diversity and inclusion. Next, we have Kevin Dick. Kevin is the Economic Development Director for the City of Charlotte. In Kevin's role, he oversees all day-to-day business operations of the Economic Development Division. Under Kevin's leadership, the department focuses on 5 key areas: corridor revitalization, entrepreneurial startups and small business growth, workforce development, international relations and commerce, and development and redevelopment. Next, we have Charlotte City Councilman at Large, James Mitchell. Councilman Mitchell is the chair of the Economic Development Committee. He is also a graduate from the Harvard University John F. Kennedy School of Government Leadership Program, North Carolina Institute of Political Leadership, Leadership Charlotte, and Focus on Leadership. James also served as the president of the National League of Cities, only the second elected official from North Carolina to serve as the president of the organization in its 92-year history. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Bruce.
Thank you for having us.
Our conversation today is focused on the intersection of digital equity and workforce development. And I wanted to start off with defining digital equity. According to the National Digital Inclusion Alliance, a unified voice for digital inclusion advocacy, digital equity is defined as a condition in which all individuals and communities have the information technology capacity for full participation in our society, democracy, and economy. Digital equity is necessary for civic and cultural participation, employment, lifelong learning, and access to essential services. So for a definition of workforce development, let's turn to our panel. Gentlemen, how would we define workforce development in Charlotte, and who are the key players? Kevin, you want to start us off?
Sure. Bruce, I think that the definition of workforce development or talent development, as it's increasingly being called nowadays, is similar. It's similar in Charlotte to a lot of other places, and that is, I think, a few different key components are present. One, there needs to be connectivity, right? So there needs to be that connection of the job seeker to the business. In other words, the supply to the demand. Also, there needs to be preparation, and that's very important. We need to make sure that we are sort of hitching our wagons, if you will, to growth industries, industries where there will be a lot of employment opportunity, progressively moving or upward employment opportunities. opportunities for individuals to earn competitive salaries with benefits so that they can take care of their families and themselves. So you have connectivity, you have preparation, also recruitment. You know, so there are a lot of individuals coming into Charlotte each and every day. We know there's a net amount of roughly 44 individuals, right? So people are coming to the city a lot because of the quality of life advantages, a lot because there's great corporate presence here. And so it's a matter of making sure that the talent matches the opportunity, and so that applies to native Charlotteans, and it also applies to inward migration.
Just a follow-up, Kevin's been a modest individual, so let me brag on him a little bit. So the city of Charlotte is undertaking $1 million of workforce development, and to us, it's taking those citizens that have barriers to employment. And so what Kevin is doing, there's three main components. One is fiber optics, one is highway construction, and one is residential and commercial construction. And so when he was mentioning matching demand with supply, we think doing that and then collaborating with Goodwill as well as the Urban League on being our partners. So I think the city sees this as we'll take the initiative, we'll provide the funding, but we need partners in our community to really make this successful.
Speaking of those partners, who are some of the key, for folks who are watching, who are, learning about this subject for the first time and interested in potentially engaging with some of these, who are the key workforce development partners here in Charlotte? And I think it's fair to toot your own horn, the
That's
great
right.
work you're doing at Charlotte-Mecklenburg.
Dr. Graham, you can take this one.
Right.
Oh, thanks. Well, you have several, and they actually are in both the public and private sector. And so when you think about workforce development, one thing I do want to level set is that when you talk about workforce system, you have to think broadly about the sectors that are involved in it. So there's economic development, and that's the agencies like a Charlotte Chamber or like a Charlotte Regional Partnership, as well as some parts of government arms that actually go out and seek industry to bring to the area, but more important, that they also seek sectors to bring to the area. So for this to be an energy hub, for example, there has to be intentional recruitment of energy companies to the area. And so you always start there because that's the end game, right? That's where you want to end. Then there's workforce development. So organizations like mine, Charlotte Works is the workforce development board for the city of Charlotte and for Mecklenburg County. And with us there are other partners such as a Goodwill and Urban League, Charlotte Area Fund, CPCC, Central Piedmont Community College, the university systems here such as Queens, and several other nonprofit partners, vocational rehab and others that all play a role in this. And so you have workforce development, and then there's education. And education is very important because education, starting even at your K-12 level, all the way through universities and colleges, really are where the development of a pipeline begins. And then, while those are traditionally considered to be all part of the workforce system, I actually add one, and that is actually community development. So you need to understand where workforce housing is. What are we doing around digital platforms? Those become important also to development of a workforce system. And so transportation, all of those issues play a part in how we develop around workforce development. And so I will say this in closing, is that digital inclusion is important to the workforce system because it really touches on 7 main areas. And I wrote them down, just want to just quickly go through them. One, it's about preparation. You can't prepare people if they don't have access to technology and platforms. In today's environment, there are no jobs that don't require some ability within technology. Access to jobs. So for even someone to get access, they actually need digital inclusion to be part of the mix. Performance in jobs. And so having the skills to actually perform are there that actually lead to retention. Innovation. We use technology to innovate every day. Not just create, but to innovate. And growth in the job. So in order to do that, if you're actually able to retain employment, you're actually able to perform well and innovate, then you talk about growth in a role. And the other is it also aids with dealing with barriers to employment.
Right.
So again, talking about those other ancillary things that we don't normally think about, workforce, housing, transportation, other things that also require digital inclusion. So digital inclusion really is very much a key component to our future talent and our ability to be globally competitive.
Is one point I wanted to sort of go back and highlight, and you mentioned education as one of the areas of workforce development. So sort of taking that piece a little bit further, what policies can we be implementing in our education system to prepare students for work, jobs of the future or even the jobs of today, knowing that there's a potential gap between what they are having access to learning and the skills needed by our employers?
Well, I think there's a couple things. One, you have to start in this state, you have to start at state level. So a conversation I had with the North Carolina superintendent was that as we develop curriculums, one, we need the input of industry, but we also have to ensure that it's digitally friendly and accessible. And so part of that is, one, retooling teachers around technology and the use of technology in the classroom. Two, giving youth access. We actually can have budgets that allow us to have all students having access, or even having in their own hand a tablet that they could take home and actually use. So you have those type of policies that you can institute. The other thing is actually in the curriculum development itself, that it must be integrated fully into all facets of what we do. So it's not always just a separate sort of issue of curriculum development. It actually has to be integrated fully into it. And that's through intentional acts, intentional desire. And I think part of the issue is that while I'm also an academic myself, we can't always be the only ones developing curriculums. We actually need those in the digital space, those in industry helping develop those curriculums as we try to develop talent, but also develop access for individuals.
And that I'm sorry.
I was just going to follow from a policy standpoint. Bruce, this came first to my attention around 2007. I used to serve District 2 on the Charlotte City Council, Batersford Road. And I remember Ms. Maddie Marshall, President of Historic Washington Heights, she said to me, she said, Council, she said, our kids are not prepared to compete in the classroom. And I said, why? She said, we got this digital divide. We start hearing about the digital divide. And so what I had to do, because city's really not responsible for education, but I think as a leader, I had to find a solution. So I reached out to Michelle Thomas, who worked for Microsoft. And at that time, Al Austin was executive director of McCory Y. So the three of us got together with Maddie Marshall, and we developed an after-school program. Microsoft donated the computers to the Y. And so we had about 70 young elementary students from, I think we started from the first grade to the fifth grade, and we use it as an after-school pilot program. I'm proud to say here in 2016, Microsoft is still donating computers. McCory Y is a facility. No kids are still learning. So I do think education might be a CMS and the Board of Commission might fund it, but it's a responsibility of all of us elected officials because it's the #1 priority for our community.
Well, I think what's been revealed in these past two answers is, I don't think we can overemphasize the role of industry. On the policy development, from a policy development standpoint, from a funding standpoint, I also think there's an opportunity to influence curriculum on what I would call a just-in-time basis. And so whereas industry can certainly get involved at the state level with the superintendent, helping to really look at what curriculum should be in a both present and futuristic way. What kinds of curriculum do we need to have in the schools in the next to prepare young people for the next 5 to 10 to 15 to 20 years? And actually those time trajectories are probably too far out because the pace of technology is so fast that sometimes we can't plan that far, but we can plan ahead. But there's also the just-in-time opportunity. So Councilman Mitchell mentioned earlier our Project Peace initiative. This is the city's $1 million investment into training and job placement for individuals with multiple barriers to employment. But a very key component of that program is the corporate advisory council that exists for each one of the training areas. And so we're convening businesses within a sector, as Dr. Graham alluded to earlier. We're convening businesses within the various sectors that would benefit from individuals getting trained. And so we're getting those companies around the table, asking them, how should we carry out this training?
Right.
Not just from the occupational skills training standpoint, but from the core skills standpoint. Because along with the fact that there's a lack of digital access, you mentioned 20%, couple that with the lack of social capital.
Right.
Basically, individuals not knowing how to network, not knowing who to network with, not knowing how to prepare a resume, interview, shake hands on a job interview or in the workplace, conflict resolution. All of those things are just as impactful as the lack of an ability to use a digital device. So we have to couple the needs for preparation in all of those areas with a very strong corporate and industry influence, because no matter what the talent development or training paradigm, it's got to be business driven.
So to follow up on a couple of points you all made, thinking about, we hear a lot of talk about the skills of the future, the skills needed for the jobs of the future, knowing that roughly 20% of our community does not have internet access at home, and also knowing that that number is not equitably distributed across our community, that there is pockets that number can go north of 40, 50%. Where do people who are at opportunity go to find the training, to learn these skills, and sort of specifically for this conversation around the digital skills? I'm just wondering, obviously there's some programs at Charlotte Works that help do that, but can you talk about those and maybe some other places that people find?
Well, Dr. Graham, you can talk about too, the Urban League, which we use, and Charlotte Works. Yes,
Well,
sir.
first, let me just thank you, Bruce, for using the term "at opportunity." I think that's important to this whole conversation because years ago when we coined that term and even patented it, it was because we wanted people to stop referring to these communities at risk
Right.
and refer to them as that opportunity, because no one invests in risk, you invest in opportunities.
Right.
And this is part of the conversation that we're having right now. We're talking about investment in opportunities that are for us as well as for those individuals. There are several organizations that you can go to for digital inclusion learning. So the Urban League is one of those, as Councilman Mitchell mentioned. Charlotte Works. But we also have public libraries. We have other workforce entities like a Goodwill and some others that all provide this. What you're probably really needing to do is an asset mapping, though, in this community of where all of those avenues are. And I think just as important, just as a convener of the workforce space, one of the things that we do is try to pass down knowledge. So we are heavily into the development of career pathway models that we pass down through schools, that we pass down through other agencies, but that has to also happen in the digital space. So there's organizations such as yours who have these strong digital knowledge and how to actually implement. That knowledge has to be passed on to these other organizations who actually already have the trust of the people that come to them. The other thing, too, is that in this notion of access, particularly around organizations, we need to also make sure that we're going into communities that we identify that have some of the, what I call the primary deserts. They're job deserts, food deserts, health deserts, digital deserts, and they normally exist in the same space. So you have, for example, Novant and Carolina's healthcare system actually attempting to actually provide services in some of these neighborhoods, right? So how would a digital platform latch on to that movement, for example? Or for someone like a Charlotte Works that looking at creating a super center for workforce development systems and partners, right? We're going to look at that and be in the center of where most of the unemployment is. how does a digital Charlotte,
Right.
others get engaged, and then put ancillary services there. So part of this too is that access is about also latching on to existing movements and structures, because part of the problem is we keep looking at this as something separate outside of all of these things, and it's not. It's actually integrated and woven in.
And just to follow on Dr. Graham, and you have new entities that's stepping up. Kevin, I can tell you, we working on the North End Smart District. The city's putting about $28 million from Graham Street all the way to North Tryon. And then we have Junior Achievement, who said we want to be a partner. So Junior Achievement is talking about moving in on Graham Street and helping, to your point, Dr. Graham, be part of the solution for that digital inclusion. So how we now, with the education background we have, with the reputation we have, how can we be a player in making sure that those in those communities, talking about the Druid Hills community, how they can now take advantage and be able to compete?
Also, though, and Bruce, and you may, if I'm jumping the gun, tell me.
No, do your thing.
But you know, one thing that I also think is worth mentioning is with digital inclusion, there also becomes the opportunity to not just become a worker, but an owner. Digital inclusion can really be a door to entrepreneurship. You know, now people run businesses from a laptop and a Starbucks, right? So even the access points in order to business ownership are now different. So if we can get over the digital, achieve digital equity by engaging in digital inclusion activities, you taught me that.
That was pretty good.
Thanks. If we can engage in those activities, now we can open doors not just to people working for others, but working for themselves.
So I want to, thinking about our audience on the live stream, one, just a reminder to, if you have questions, to leave them in the comments. I see we've got a few coming in. We'll get to those questions here in a second. But thinking about this idea of latching on in a positive sense, what would you tell other digital equity or digital inclusion groups, either here in Charlotte or hopefully we've got some folks watching from across the country, or what advice would you give them on how to work with workforce development agencies? What sort of mindset or what sort of things should they be thinking about as we prepare to latch on, using that phrase?
I really think it's starting that conversation with the end users, the business community and the job seeker community, and then that filters into how the two groups best coincide. You know, I think that there are a lot of things that you can do digitally now that people have been doing for a long time. They just never had the ability to do it as fast, as automated, et cetera, et cetera. So I think really it's also going back to the basics of what those two end users need in either a job seeker or you know, a particular employment trajectory, or whether, and sometimes that may include entrepreneurship, really figuring out what they want to accomplish and how digital activities, digital inclusion activities can lead to that, as opposed to seeing digital inclusion and digital equity as sort of an entity unto itself, really using it as a vehicle as opposed to a destination, if that makes sense.
It makes total sense, yeah.
The other thing I'd add to that too is to be solution-oriented thinking as you enter into potential partnerships. So when you asked about workforce, I would actually look at the workforce system itself as a whole. So yes, starting with industry and looking at what those needs are in terms of technology, right? And then being able to take that to a school or to an education partner and saying, this is what we've heard from industry. This is something that we can help provide. How can we work together with your existing populations to do this? Because part of what you're doing at the same time is meeting people where they already are. Right? And so then you're getting that access point. It's the same with workforce development agencies and so forth. So what you're really trying to do is you're starting there, but you're also coming in with the solution in mind. And I think that we all know what the problem is, right? What we're really talking about now is developing some real tactics that land on the ground, right? So taking theory and applying it with some wheels, right? And I think that that's one of the places I see the most opportunity for digital inclusion, is particularly in a lot of areas that I see programs at a Y or somewhere else. Well, yes, they're using computers, but that doesn't mean that that's digital literacy. And so that's where you all come in with your expertise. I think that it's just critical that that knowledge be passed down. And so you really view yourself just like we do as a convener in the workforce space. You're a convener in the digital space. But part of that convening means you're actually providing that technical assistance that allows everyone now to have the ability to teach and preach from the same pulpit.
I like what you said about leveraging existing digital interests. You know, I think, 20 years ago, the digital divide conversation was different.
That's right.
Because there were people who literally did not have access to PCs or laptops at all, or any other digital device. Now with the advent of the smartphone, there are a lot of people using smartphones every day to basically, it's a fixture of their lives. You know, I have a niece and nephew. I don't recognize them if I see them without their phone. I don't know who they are. But
sound like my daughter.
But like Dr. Graham said, it doesn't necessarily correlate in all cases to digital literacy. But you can leverage the digital usage to get to the digital literacy.
So I want to switch it up just a little bit. Have a different question, sort of on a different trajectory here. There's of course a lot of talk about the relationship between Charlotte and our state government, but setting
Talks about that.
said I don't know. Somebody wrote it on here. I just read it. Setting aside those differences, what opportunities do you think exist for collaboration with state-controlled workforce development dollars and the opportunity we have here in our community to prepare people for these jobs?
That's a good question. I think one of them is we have to actually do a better job with metrics and showing where the actual biggest gaps and opportunities are. And for a lot of state representatives that I meet with, I have found that there is a deep lack of knowledge because this is what we often do. We'll often say there are 8,000 jobs available. And then say there's 10,000 people unemployed. Naturally, these match together. But what we found is there's such a skill gap. Right? So we need to expose those individuals to the skills gaps and then come with our own recommendation of where we want dollars specifically spent. I think oftentimes we come more in a generic sense, and what people really need is they actually need a firm roadmap. You know, what is it that I'm telling them? One of the things that I just worked with City Council as well as Kevin on was advocacy for more Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act dollars to come to this state.
That's right.
Because the other thing is that we are actually one of the most underfunded workforce systems amongst our competitor cities. So places like a Louisville or a Atlanta, Austin, Texas, or even Nashville, Tennessee, another competitor, actually per capita spend more dollars in investment in workforce than we do. So we have to actually now communicate much stronger what those needs are, be specific, make specific recommendations, and then I think you'll see more of a desire for elected officials to hear that.
Well, and the other thing I would add to that is that particularly in Dr. Graham's case, but also with the county, which administers Department of Social Services, TANF dollars, these are all federal funds. They emanate from federal agencies. So if Charlotte-Mecklenburg is underfunded, for example, in the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act space, there's a fairly substantial possibility that the state is underfunded. So a way that local governments can collaborate with the state is to form a united front to actually ask the federal government And look at what's going on in North Carolina. You know, we're one of the fastest growing states. We're the 9th most populated state right now, I believe 9th. And there are a lot of companies migrating to North Carolina. You know, in the midst of some of the legislative challenges we've had over the last year, we're still experiencing business recruitment and expansion. And so that really necessitates greater funding for that preparation piece. Like Dr. Graham said, because you have 10,000 unfilled jobs and 8,000 people, if there's a skills gap, you're never going to be able to bring those two groups together, or at least not in the volume that we want.
You know, and Dr. Graham, I think, touched on it earlier, Bruce. For us policymakers, elected officials, we have to listen to those who play in that space and have the information. So he came and spoke to the ED committee. We were shocked when he said per capita how the city of Charlotte is not competitive against a Nashville and Memphis. I remember I made a comment. I said, I hate being in second place to Nashville and Memphis. But what we challenged Dr. Graham was saying, can you give us some speaking points? Because we were about to go to Washington, meet with our congressional and senator representative, and share with them, with your help, we need to make sure that North Carolina can be competitive. I would tell you this, when it comes to education, I think you have the federal, state, and local all working together. What we're missing is having the right people at the table to give us the right data so we can make the policy changes.
Let me tell you, too, I'll just illustrate how important this is, because one of the things that the Councilman Mitchell's group want to advocate for, based off of those bullet points that supplied, is this. When North Carolina last year got $3 million in cuts from the federal government in terms of workforce development, Charlotte got cut 1.2 million of that $3 million.
See, so
That's 40%.
that's right.
So you think about that. So our areas investment in advocacy, for example, that includes digital literacy and inclusion, has to be part of that mix, because numerically this county holds over 10% of this state's population.
Right.
And a lot of its growth. And so when the state gets a cold from the feds, we get pneumonia.
Yeah.
So what's, just sort of piggybacking off of that, what's the role then of, in the public-private partnership, or the opportunity maybe is a better way to phrase it, what opportunities are there then, you know, knowing that we have this deficiency in funding, if there's not a clear path in the sort of short term to increase that funding on the public funding side, either what role or what opportunity is there for private dollars to help supplement that?
I mean, I think it's turning not just into an opportunity, but maybe mandate is too strong a word,
Right,
but necessity, because companies, a very substantial amount of operational expenditures for corporations is on recruitment and training. And the more you have to do it, the more money you spend, which means that if you don't hire right the first time, you have that as a very repetitive expense. So in that vein, there are models around the country that reflect this. Private sector funding of training is possible and important. We have this basically there's uncertainty now with the new administration in terms of how, and that's not a political statement, it's just
reality.
It's just reality.
Yeah.
We don't know how the administration is going to fund the Department of Labor, the Department of Health and Human Services. We just don't know yet. We're hearing that HUD funding, Housing and Urban Development funding, might be fully cut. And community development block grants are vehicles. In fact, it's a partial funding source for our Project Peace program.
Right.
So community development block grants are a funding vehicle for workforce development nationally. And so we have all of these public sector pots of funding being diminished. And then you have companies that know that their talent is their best resource. So why not invest in it on the front end? That's why I'm proud of what we're doing with the Project Peace program and having corporate involvement help design curriculum, interact with participants during the course of the training, and then be at the recruitment events to hire these individuals. It's a turnkey operation. I'm helping to influence how an individual will be trained. Then I'm getting to know that individual. And then if I have opportunities, who am I going to be more inclined to want to hire? Someone I know and someone whose talent and training I can vouch for. And so companies have that opportunity in a real way. And it's going to start to, if we can convey to businesses the opportunity in terms of them knowing that I can invest on the front end and probably invest less than I would have to on the back end.
Let me just give you another example too, Bruce. The National League of Cities, we're fortunate to be hosting the conference November 15th through the 19th. And Tom Warshaw and Don here have done a great job. There's a youth summit component to it. And you talk about the private community. Wells Fargo, Google, AT&T have stepped up. Those are the three companies have stepped up very early and said, we want to make sure there's a digital inclusion component of this youth conference in the city of Charlotte. We're excited. We got youth groups coming from Monroe, as far as Mississippi, Oregon. But I think that we making that a big agenda item for our youth and have the private corporations, to your point, say, we want to be there on the front end, training, development, instead on the back end when we got to spend more costs once they hire as employees. So we're excited about having a youth conference here in Charlotte.
That might be the first time that Monroe, Mississippi, and Oregon were all in the same sentence.
I agree.
Let's take a user-submitted question here, and I apologize for zooming in here so I can read it because I forgot my glasses today. Let's see. Brittany R. asks, where do you all believe ISPs fall in the preparation for a stronger workforce? And just not to use coded language, ISPs, Internet Service Provider for our audience. So where do you all believe Internet Service Providers fall in the preparation for a stronger workforce?
I mean, particularly in the context of this conversation, I mean, they have a substantial presence. I mean, you mentioned
Historic, yep.
Right, you just mentioned some examples of how they can participate. We are calling, for example, for different ISPs to be part of the Corporate Advisory Council for Broadband and Fiber Optic Cabling. They not only are a lot of the major ISPs, they're major employers, right? So they can hire across many platforms and many of their business lines. But they're also responsible for one of the key elements of attracting or retaining business is infrastructure. And so traditionally we've thought of infrastructure as roads, sidewalks,
Water system.
water systems, transit.
Electricity, yeah.
Now the
Yes.
emerging important
That's right.
infrastructure is digital.
That's right.
infrastructure.
That's right.
Which is very important, and one of the places that these entities that provide that type of service have to actually look at their corporate responsibility, even some of their philanthropic responsibility, into some of these digital deserts where that 20% lives. And so we have to actually, and this may be a strong word, but I mean it, hold them responsible. Because of the profits that are made in so many other areas, that this is the place in which, you know, if I were to liken it almost to CRA credits for a bank, you know, I think that you need to have that type of credentialing for any of the utilities, actually. We do have that in some senses for other utilities, and we probably need it here. And so that actually not so much forces investment in those areas, but really then makes us lift our competitiveness. In the last international program study survey of international education, and we look at where we ranked as 36th in the industrialized world, right? And here we are in this postmodern society, right? And we're still the richest country in the world and the most innovative country in the world. I believe that some of our lagging behind is due to the fact that we have wasted too much human capital in communities that we have sort of disenfranchised both economically digitally and otherwise. If we actually deal with that, our Achilles heel will be healed.
But I want to tag on a bit too, because there's a corporate social responsibility lens through which to see that, but there's also a value proposition. If you look at communities that aren't disinvested, that aren't distressed, I mean, middle income to high income communities, all of the digital infrastructure is there. It's placed. There's incremental gains to that can take place from these ISPs servicing these communities. But there's monumental gains servicing disinvested communities, because right now they have not penetrated them traditionally. So imagine what would happen if they started to penetrate them and really take advantage of the spending that occurs in those communities. Because unfortunately, rightly, wrongly, or indifferently, there's spending that still occurs in those communities, even if the income isn't as high. So, ISPs can also, I think, view it through that lens.
So, for you two, what can the city do to? Because I think if we were to, and not to call it any specific provider, but if we were to look at maps of where service was built and where service was not built, it might look like a mortgage map from the 70s, right? There might be some interesting reasons why places weren't built, but now we're here today. What can the city do to help incentivize those investments? And I know incentives is a touchy word, but maybe there's a better word.
No, you're right.
It can be, but incentives can also be a generic word. It doesn't always have to be cash incentives. I mean, Councilman Mitchell alluded to the North End Smart District.
Right.
We're incentivizing development.
That's right.
By committing $28 million in infrastructure investment, because we know that can attract private investment, including technology companies.
Bruce, from my standpoint, and this is kind of personal to me because I have a teenage daughter who's attending a CMS school, and even some of her classmates don't have access to internet provider, and then I'm fussing at her that she eating all the data up, and I had to catch myself because she said, "Daddy, at least I have the opportunity to have data. I got some of my classmates that don't." And so as a city official who wants Charlotte to be a winning city, I need to have a conversation to those providers and talk about, here's where we need you to make a difference in our community. We just had a great retreat, and we talked about what makes city winning, and the big thing was younger millennium want Wi-Fi, want digital, and they need it now. And I think you look at Charlotte, we have some deserts, Brother Graham, as you say, in certain our communities. And so for me, I need to be able to point and say, I need you to put it on this side of a corridor, and so everything can be equitable. Kevin just got selected, the city of Charlotte, the National League of Cities, this equitable opportunity. And so Kevin's in there with Seattle, Memphis, Boston, Charlotte, and Houston.
Houston, Boston, Minneapolis, Memphis, and Milwaukee.
So I do think it's on my plate to have that kind of discussion and say, we don't need you to put everything on Brown Road or East Field Road, but here's some opportunities. You put it on Statesville Avenue and Graham Street.
And I'll say this too, as someone who's, worked for this city, and working closely with these two, and someone who just moved into Councilman's district, is part of this still starts with industry in another way, and that is creating opportunity zones. Right now, the opportunity zones that we have created are in Uptown Charlotte, Valentine, South Park, and some peripheral areas in University and others, right?
Right.
So those are intentional acts.
Right.
They were selected.
Right.
Right? And what we have to do now is think about also incentives for industry to actually create opportunity zones in East and West Charlotte.
There you go. Yeah.
And so one of the ways you do that is you think about, one, the types of jobs you incentivize, right, and employment opportunities. So instead of investing in, say, median salary jobs of $68,000, maybe it is in that $35,000 to $45,000 range that you start to place those types of employment opportunities and try to encourage employees. We can't make them, but you can encourage them to go into some of those areas and then provide jobs to that workforce. And then, just like you did with Old Mill Towns, you begin to develop housing patterns around it. You begin to develop digital inclusion. One of the things, Bruce, is we was one of the founding members, sort of the group. By the way, I was on the panel that hired Bruce. So I can brag a little bit.
This is payback.
One of the things that you can do also as you think about affordable housing and affordable housing with emphasis on ownership initiatives is that the requirement of building those is that they obviously come fully equipped with broadband. And as you develop that type of approach, what you're doing is you're bringing all of the wraparound services and opportunities to it, right? And I think that we have to think more in those terms of creating opportunity zones. We do it already. We're just selecting certain communities and people for it. And lastly, I'll just say this. When you talk about opportunity and the reason that this is so important in these communities, the younger you get in population, the more diverse the population gets. So as you look at that age range from 0 to 12, it's over 50% diverse. Right now, if I'm looking at everyone above 70, you're talking about 70% white. But when you get to that 0 to 12 space, it's over 50% diverse. The city of Charlotte itself, in the 2010 census, 52% African American and Latino. So in other words, when these communities are there, they actually already hold most of our future human capital in them. So we have to develop that. If I'm looking at you right now, Bruce, today, the only white male on the panel, what I would say to you is that you have 2 children. One of them is white and one of them is a child of color. That's the reality.
So I think that's a good place to wrap up the conversation. We've sort of hit our 45-minute mark, and I want to be respectful of everybody's time. We did have a few more questions here, but hopefully we can invite you all back and maybe do another session of this one time. But I do want to give you all an opportunity if there's anything that I didn't mention or that you want to close on or say.
I believe in collaboration, and we're going to need more partners, private and public partners, to be at the table and to make sure it's more digital inclusion. I think you have 3 fans here who are going to do their very best in our leadership roles to position Charlotte in a better place.
If you are in the broadband and fiber optic industry and you want to have the opportunity to influence training, get to know viable candidates, and hire them, call Kevin Dick at the City of Charlotte.
How are they going to reach you?
Kevin.dick@charlottenc.gov.
There we go.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
And just keep in mind that we are talking about a great return on investment. So investment in human capital, talent, is the only way that we will see economic mobility occur in this city and this nation.
So let me do something Kevin just made. I got to be honest. So if you want to know more information about this North End Smart District, please reach out to me at james.mitchell@charlottenc.gov. I think that's going to be a great model for the city.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, thank you all for joining us. Thank the panel very much for joining us. We really appreciate it. Thank you everyone on our live stream, and for our guests who are here in the studio with us today. And until next time, I'm your host, Bruce Clark, and remember, digital equity equals opportunity for our community. Thank you.